everyone can see the lectures I've got. As Sam says, it was meant to be last September, but here we are in April 2021 with my joining you. Delayed because, as we all know, the planet was plunged into a global pandemic. We live with it still, and it has changed our lives. We all talk about returning to normal, but we worry, I suspect, in our heart of hearts, that the old normal has gone or perhaps will be very different. St. Anthony Hopkins commented recently that it feels like we've lost all our anchors. It is an honour to be with you. And I think one of the reasons I've been asked this evening is to do with this book that I published, this book that was published last year, just before we went into the first lockdown. Like There's No Tomorrow takes seriously the threat of climate catastrophe. It describes my journey by canal boat from East Anglia to Skipton on an aeroboat called the Lark Ascending. You can see it at Snagle if you happen to be passing. It was a transformative journey, for I had increasingly recognised in myself levels of anxiety that were hard to ignore. And after Greta Thunberg began her strike in 2018, it seemed my life was based on a major denial, and I really had to get my head around it and my heart around it too. And yes, dum spiro spero. While I breathe, I hope, and while I hope, I breathe. It was essential, I was finding, to live hopefully and positively, even as we honestly contemplate what is happening to our beautiful world. This can be unbearable terrain. The realities are bleak and without precedent in human experience. And I'm not the only one. Hannah Malcolm's recent collection of perspectives from around the world, Words for a Dying World, takes climate catastrophe as the reality, hitting hard already as land is swamped with rising sea levels, and that's in the Maldives, as storms destroy, and that's in Zimbabwe, as bushfires rage, and that's quite obvious where that is. And then just very recently, the mountains of Mourne on fire just across the water from where I am in West Cumbria. So I hope against hope. What I fear is an uninhabitable earth where my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all future generations cannot survive on a planet that has burned up. That's an enormous, unprecedented threat to all of us. It makes the future unpredictable and can only induce in us all the signs of grief, anger, denial, repudiation. And we've had a bit of a foretaste of that, I think, with COVID and not knowing quite what the next day, the next month is going to hold for us. If the world is dying, then we need a moral ecology that enables us to live honestly and truthfully, coping with our own emotions as well as those of others. At heart, that will mean that we live not for ourselves, but for others, I believe, able to extend beyond ourselves with a love that embraces other people, other species, and this blue planet in all its incredible diversity. Contemporary literature can capture the awful tensions of life in such dystopian circumstances. Perhaps the best I've read lately is the magical realist novel by Richard Flanagan. You might have read it, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. As the main character, Francie, dies, or as her family prevent her dying with the dignity that she yearns to have, the novel portrays the disintegration, literally, of her grown children as they struggle with death and dying, reflecting, I think, at a deep metaphorical level, the life and humanity itself failing to cope with the realities of climate catastrophe. The tensions are personal, with each character trapped, unable to find the redemptive power of love, and to the end when a fragile love for the other in death brings a liberation of sorts. These realities are the realities of the Anthropocene. Hannah Malcolm calls it the period in time when the earth can no longer forget our deeds. She argues that the world is affected by human beings in space, across the globe, in different and particular ways, and also in time, in what was, in what is, and in what will be. We belong together in time and space, across the whole creation, across the whole world. And so we must find ways to grieve and lament the passing of what is irrevocably lost, to live today as truthfully and carefully as we can, treading lightly on this blue planet, and with hope nonetheless for a future that will be full of grace. I hope tonight's lecture offers some food for thought for each of us to work on our own moral ecology to that end, finding ways to live in reality and hope rather than curled up in a corner full of fear and despair. I found myself contemplating a way of thinking that sees order and covenant at the heart of life in existence. This is to understand the world as deeply ordered, as many scientists like Simon Conway Morris and those involved with the Faraday Institute suggest. With order comes morality and justice. G.K. Chesterton wrote in one of his Father Brown mysteries some words which capture the deep moral order and justice to the universe. He wrote, "Reason and justice grip the remotest and loneliest star. Look at those stars. Don't they look as if they were single diamonds and sapphires? Well, you can imagine any mad botany or geology you please. Think of forests of adamant with leaves of brilliance. Think the moon is a blue moon, a single elephantine sapphire. But don't fancy that all the frantic astronomy would make the smallest difference to the reason and justice of conduct. On plains of opal, under cliffs cut out of pearl, you will still find a notice board, thou shalt not steal." To talk of a moral order at the heart of things, as Chesterton does, is not to advocate lives of boring sameness or determinism or fate, not at all. When we begin with a sense of order, we see the world around us following deep and reliable patterns of growth and decay, of infinite variety and entanglement, as, for example, predictable weather enables intricate synergies to occur between warmth and sunlight, blossom, insects and pollination, where life explodes in glorious diversity. That intricacy is all around us and in us, in the soil, air and water, an entanglement to life, as Melvin Sheldrake, for example, describes. The physical world continues into the moral, for our own lives are more productive and fruitful when a sense of order and discipline enables us to flourish into the fullness of our humanity, entangled with others, with habits of thoughtfulness, carefulness, cheerfulness, and joyfulness. When we appreciate that we live in a moral universe of order rather than disorder, we're more inclined, I think, to be happy, productive, and fruitful. It's too early to say what the long-term impacts of this pandemic will be on our lifestyles. One hope often expressed is that kindness and self-sacrifice that we've witnessed will persist, with a change of priorities and pace in life. Perhaps the virus has reminded us that to be fully alive is to know death at the heart of life. Love expressed in so many ways, reminding us that death is not the final word. Christians maintain that nothing can separate us from love, which ultimately is the love of God. Separation, distance, the inability to hug, to be close, to be intimate, alienation, brokenness, loneliness, all take us towards disorder, where we grow further apart from each other. That disorder in our lives is redeemed by acts of love, of kindness, of common humanity. We learn again that we are dependent on one another. Dependence. We have a love-hate relationship with it, don't we? So much of what it means to be a modern individual pulls us away towards autonomy, self-realization, self-this, self-that. Dependence makes us feel weak. Increasingly, we don't much like belonging either. It ties us down as somewhere people, with commitments to localities, to other people that we might not like very much. Much easier, much simpler to be anywhere people, belonging to the like-minded in an echo chamber, where we can feel the intense satisfaction of tribal rectitude. Perhaps COVID has meant that we've thought more deeply about dependence and interdependence. It takes us to the heart of the problem, for it affects us, not just us as humanity, but the planet itself. For of course we belong within and are dependent upon the ecosystems and complex patterns that make life possible. Modern humanity prefers to control with an instrumental rationality, willfully forgetful of that dependence. And so we learn from a young age to use and abuse nature rather than loving it and cherishing it. Perhaps COVID will bring new insights here. Let's hope so. So, a new moral ecology. If we are interdependent and know our humanity grows when we participate in love, then let's explore ways to align ourselves with a deep pattern and order, recognizing our dependence on other people across the world, other species, other patterns of existence in which we live and move and have our being. This takes us towards the ancient concept of covenant. A life based on covenant respects the responsibilities and commitments, the promises of our lives. A blessed rage for order takes seriously the covenants that enable us to flourish as individuals and communities the world over, framing the lifestyle decisions of our daily lives as responsible inhabitants in the earth that is our home. So let's explore a little more what covenant might look like. A familiar way in which people make covenants today is when they commit themselves to another person. There's a traditional saying you'll hear before a wedding that the bride, no, let's say the couple, need to wear something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Perhaps that's a good way to structure thoughts of a new moral ecology. Easily memorable and symbolic of our commitment and promise in a relationship which has to be at the heart of humanity's future existence on planet Earth. Relationship with the environment, with other people, with the past, present, and future generations and realities. So maybe we can learn from the old, ancient wisdom. Embrace new lifestyles with urgency. Borrow rather than stealing. Cherishing the blue planet on which we live. For our children and grandchildren, for the species and habitats across the world. So let's begin with something old, and I'll dwell on this first aspect longer than the rest, as it's foundational. Written into the texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition are stories of an age-old covenant between God and humanity. Let's consider, for instance, the Genesis story. The Genesis story of creation, which emerges out of the original chaos of a formless void and darkness covering the face of the deep. A wind from God sweeps over the waters, and from chaos comes order, light, sky, land, vegetation, creatures. And humanity emerges in the midst of all this abundant life, with the injunction to have dominion, and a better word is stewardship over all creatures. Things start to go wrong, with human assertion against the original covenant that asked of humanity a sense of thankfulness, obedience, and dependence upon God. Instead, what emerges, as the narrative goes, is the pride of domination and its fruits in sin, separation and banishment, alienation and pain. Adam and Eve are forced out. One son kills another in jealousy. Things go from bad to worse as humanity seeks to make a name for itself. Until the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and the Lord was sorry he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Only Noah was righteous enough to build the ark, gather creatures, and survive the flood that destroyed the earth and all its abundance. After the flood subsided, a rainbow, and the words of God, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." An everlasting covenant, a covenant that teaches us of God's enduring and sustaining love for creation. The classic doctrine is providence, God's providential care, which is both general and special. General, in that there is a deep pattern and reliability to existence that we can trust. A normal, that means we can say with confidence that the sun will rise, that the tides will ebb and flow, that the swallows will return each spring. There is also a special sense of God's providence, whereby all receive God's loving attention, turned with mercy on each and every creature. This is the nature of the ancient covenant made by God. It is as everlasting as the hills, something old. Ellen F. Davis finds the evidence for the created order as she studies the Bible, and the injunction for humanity to align itself with the deep wisdom of God. She writes, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. This brief statement sets forth the central truth underlying all biblical statements about God as creator. The world is a product of God's wisdom and exquisite care. It follows, then, that human wisdom necessarily has an ecological dimension. That is, it involves directing our own careful attention to learning about and preserving the world that God has made." She shows how we are within creation and must listen deeply and attend to the wisdom that is the deep note, the cantus firmus of God in an ordered and providential universe. An understanding of God's creation and providence that gives us the sense that the creation entails order or ordination, the stars ordained in their orbits, tides ordained as the sea responds to the pull of moon and sun. And yes, of course, evolution happens. As Simon Conway Morris argues, evolution itself is ordained, you might say. Another way of exploring this is through the work of James Lovelock, who talks of Gaia to express the connectivity, non-separability of things, the entanglement that holds all that there is. Do look out for Luke Jerram's de Gaia, currently touring the UK. It is stunning and inspires a sense of awe at the mystery and creative power of the earth. Genesis is not the only story of the covenant of God with creation, not the only creation myth. Psalm 104, for instance, a song of praise to God's providence. God, who is wrapped in light as in a garment, riding on the wings of the wind. The myriad diversity of creation is there, the Leviathan playing in the deep, the conies, the animals of the forest, the birds of the air. And from the rich gifts of creation, what more could humanity need? This is a God whose love reaches beyond the furthest star, is deeper than the deepest ocean, is greener than the greenest green, a God whose glory fills the earth. This Anthropocene age, however, has meant a profound disruption of that order, to the extent that the very possibility of life and existence is threatened. Indeed, for many species, including human beings in many parts of the world, life has already become untenable, and extinction is a reality or imminent. Who hasn't questioned in their hearts whether God has broken the promise of the rainbow? Sophia Chirongorma contemplates the destruction caused by Cyclone Idai, which thumped into Zimbabwe in March 2019, leaving communities devastated by the raging waters, mudslides, and gigantic boulders. The searing question raised by most of the survivors who lost their homes and their loved ones was, has God reneged on the covenant made with Noah? As houses collapsed, the question was real. Sophia concludes that no, God was still keeping his end of the covenant. It is humanity that has caused unbearable damage to the ecosystem. Indeed, there is much in the Bible that blames disruption on human wrongdoing, where the consequences of humans' disregard for the covenantal order reaps its own whirlwind. Then humanity feels God's wrath at the blatant lack of respect for life and the created order. When humanity breaks the covenant of creation, we know God's wrath. The prophecies of Jeremiah, for instance, take up wailing and weeping for the mountains, and a lamentation for the pastures of the wilderness, because they are laid waste, so that no one passes through. And the lowing of cattle is not heard. Both the birds of the air and the animals have fled and are gone. I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins, a lair of jackals, and I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. Or the Psalms. The psalmist expresses God's lament, anger even, at a sinful humanity that is careless and wise in its treatment of the world. These verses from Psalm 18. The earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. A picture emerges of God as faithful and true with those who are the same, but angry when people break their side of the covenant, with physical manifestations that can be read from the natural world, blasts of the breath of God's displeasure. The anger is always secondary, though, to God's primary covenantal love, and we mustn't forget that. And it's also important to read this at the level of general providence rather than special providence. It isn't true that each time there is a tsunami or a hurricane, God is visiting vengeance on the people who suffer. But yes, when the deep order and pattern of the natural world is thrown out of kilter, when the earth is no longer securely founded and becomes shaky, then there are consequences. God's engagement with creation is characterized by sustaining love. When humanity disrupts that divine order, then the psalmist is clear. God's wrath, disappointment, and anger is expressed with dire results. It's hard to continue as normal when the enormity of the impact of climate change strikes home. We face monumental consequences, and now, as I read the Psalms and Jeremiah and other passages, it's with a growing realization of how the earth is suffering from human pride and a willful lack of attention to the deep order and covenant. These passages take on a dire warning that has to be heeded. Perhaps we should talk more about God's wrath, even as we contemplate God's love. Arjuna Anathamahan, writing from his Sri Lankan home, argues that God consents to human freedom and its costs. He says, as we continue to worship the powerful fossil fuel industry as our idol, our planet continues to die and we all continue to suffer. When wrath is thus framed as divine consent, we see how we are being punished by our sins rather than for our sins. Sin carries its own penalty. Its harmful consequences reverberate across the universe. Thus, it is not God who is actively punishing us for our sins, but ourselves. Human threat to the covenant between God and humanity causes the land to turn to desert, forests to be destroyed, the rivers to run dry, the crops and vineyards to fail, the animals to stop reproducing. Age-old passages in the Psalms and other wisdom literature which ring true in this age of climate catastrophe. We hear a judgment upon us, a call to repent. Something old can return us to the ancient wisdom of all the great religions and how good it would be to draw out similar teaching across the faiths that shows humanity how to align ourselves with the ordered creativity of God, turning away from the desecration and ravages of human sin. This is to hear the sound of God's moral purpose going out into all the world, which we ignore at our peril. As G.K. Chesterton says, wherever we are in this universe with its moral purpose, we will still find that notice board, thou shalt not steal. We should not steal and exploit that which is not ours. Trespassers should be prosecuted, if only that were true, as fires are set deliberately each year in the Amazon. Something old, a sense of original covenant and order, deserves our renewed attention, and particularly how our disordered lives and actions reap such consequences. So how might our ordered lives confess the beauty of God's peace? We need to repent, to grieve, to lament what is lost, irrevocably lost. Maggie Dawn leads the way in enabling a sense of lament to be expressed. She writes, despite the gnawing fear that God has abandoned us, or even worse, is not there at all, the pattern of lament revolves around a stubborn insistence that God is in fact present even in disaster. Anchoring hope between the reconciliation, the recollection of God's faithfulness in the past and promises for the future, create a canopy or web across the fear of abandonment in the present. The profound truth that emerges from this is that hope, which neither denies the bleakness of the present reality nor demands immediate answers, is not invested in believable outcomes, prescient knowledge, or practical solutions, but in the person of God. A canopy or web across fear. As I travelled the waterways and canals that I tell, the story I tell in Like There's No Tomorrow, the Psalms with their deep emotional wisdom enabled hope. I also found delight in the natural world, which healed, as I attended with a deep yearning for the wildness and the wet, the weeds, and what is left. That attention can be developed in simple ways. Seeing differently, Franciscans and creation is a great resource for training our eyes to see, our ears to hear. Brother Sam writes, Francis possessed the gift of keen observation of the creatures around him, their presence, their colours, their songs, and their patterns of behaviour, and what he saw often brought him delight and joy. His delight in what he observed led him to see in the natural world around him, both animate and inanimate, the footprint of the Creator, the Maker's mark, a sign of God's mercy, generosity, love, and glory. This in turn led him to thanksgiving and praise. As I travelled the length of the country in the narrowboats, the Lark Ascending, hope did spring eternal in the presence of God, revealed in the incredible diversity and intricacy of creation. I travelled with a strange melancholic sadness at the transient beauty of the season in the month of May, as hawthorn transformed to glory, fulfilling its desire for summer. I dreamed that the world's soul could be as a hawthorn in bloom, a vision of restored beauty and biodiversity to inspire the restoration of how it was once and can be again. We can also inspire young people and children with a love of nature into hopeful habits of care and stewardship. As George Monbiot suggests, we need to rewild the child. From an early age, love of the natural world starts by reading aloud, stirring the imagination, then walking and naming the trees and climbing them, the flowers, the birds, to pass on a knowledge of the environment that we don't lose all those lovely words. To listen to the wind, to hear the birdsong, is to align ourselves with the deep order and gift of the natural beauty. To learn to be still to see a kingfisher or hear a cuckoo, watch a molehill moving. To know a robin's nest, watch a frog in a pond. Habits of attentiveness to the world is a gift to learn with the young people in our lives. There is literature and poetry galore to inspire habits of hopefulness here. John Clare wrote of his hiddenness in nature. All seemed hidden as a thought unborn. As he listened intently to the nightingale, himself unnoticed in the world, his self was no longer the centre of attention, but apprehended by the otherness of the world around him. It is with such an experience that God often becomes known. What we love, we care for. This does not view nature as something to be exploited, but seeks enchantment. George Monbiot writes, environmentalism in the 20th century foresaw a silent spring in which the further degradation of the biosphere seemed inevitable. Rewilding offers the hope of a raucous summer, in which, in some parts of the world at least, destructive processes are thrown into reverse. The hope of a raucous summer. I just love that. This transformation of the deep shadows of death and fear into the grace of hope, born of the realities of what is the first habit of a moral ecology. And so we turn to something new. What is it about modernity that seduces us by the new, by innovation, by utopian blueprints? And so we disparage tradition, inherited practices, and wisdom. We embrace a Pelagian mindset that is convinced by our own efforts that we can make things better. And so we long, so long as we have the next big and purposeful initiative, new and innovative, so we can all be heroic and win the day. Or we're feeling miserable and think a little retail therapy will just do the trick, something new for the wardrobe, a new car, a new holiday destination. We are enthralled by novelty. It's deeply ingrained in our modern mindset. So we toss stuff out, buy the latest model, caught up in a consumerist culture that creates us by market forces, where even now our attention is clickbait in an unseen digital advertising. Unlike the natural world, where the seasons change in an everlasting pattern, we don't hold the ancient and the modern together very well, do we? It's either one or the other. We tend to repudiate the old, our imaginations captured by the new. If we were to build a new moral ecology upon something old, something new, perhaps it wouldn't be a new moral ecology at all. It would align us with the natural world, where something old is always something new. Embracing a circular economy, for instance, recycling, upcycling, shopping in charity shops using eBay, stopping single-use plastic and other polluting agents, living more frugally, with houses not heated to the nines, darning socks instead of buying yet another pair. Some of the patterns of life in lockdown. A moral ecology that requires an active de-learning and relearning and changing our desires, the habits of a low-carbon life. Thank heavens Joe Biden is showing the political leadership that's required. Many don't think we can wait to 2030, and we can't, to cut greenhouse gas emissions to zero, the end of petrol and diesel cars, of gas boilers. Instead, eco homes, energy efficient, with proper insulation, double glazing, solar panels on the roof, and a battery bank to store the energy. Banking and ethical investment in sustainable purposes, not fossil fuel extraction. Vegan, vegetarian diets, no longer reliant so much on meat. Growing more of our own fruit and vegetables, eating seasonally. Not everyone has the resources to make these adaptations, so we do need to campaign for political will and action for a different economic framing that moves away from the stranglehold of neoliberalism, with its mistaken belief that the market will turn up trumps and solve all our problems. The thinking's been there since Schumacher published Small is Beautiful in 1973 and Economics as if People Mattered. Today there's growing engagement, with many now developing such ideas. Each of us can change the patterns of and behaviours of our consumerist lifestyles. A change a week or a month, it all counts. So let's build a moral ecology on the new, not on the new seductions of modernity, but on recalibrating our desires and expectations to align them with a deep yearning that this blue planet continues as a flourishing, regenerated home for our children and grandchildren. Something old, something new, something borrowed. To remember something borrowed is to remind ourselves that we don't own the earth. The earth is not ours to exploit, exhaust, mine, and destroy, with a grasping, instrumental mindset that creates chaos and destruction, pollution and devastation wherever we go. If we borrow something, we remember that it is not ours. It is there to be returned, and it is our responsibility to return it in as good, if not better shape than we received it. This is a lovely book, Braiding Sweetgrass, written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, an ecologist with a Native American ancestry. She uses the wisdom of that culture to critique the rapaciousness of capitalized cultures. She describes the Wendigo, a strange legendary monster that stalks the world with the hideous stench of its carrion breath and a heart of ice. Instead of the culture of self-discipline, the Wendigo encourages rapaciousness, eating to excess. Kimmerer says we are living in the era of the Wendigo economics, of fabricated demand and compulsive overconsumption. We need to recover, as she does through journeys and encounters, another way of being that embraces engagement with the planet as sacramental language. Good stewardship. Kimmerer describes a story of corn, pumpkin, and beans that grow together from Mexico to Montana, 3 sisters. Together these plants, corn, bean, and squash, feed the people, feed the land, and feed our imaginations, telling us how we might live. The beans have a sophisticated way of using bacteria to fix nitrogen, with layers of reciprocity between the bean and the bacterium, the bean and the corn and the squash, and ultimately with people. When individual plants flourish, so does the whole, showing humanity that individuals flourish when they see themselves as part of a whole, and reciprocity, stewards in a borrowed world. Monocultural farming destroys this, as James Rebanks shows in his latest book, English Pastoral. Poor stewards break the connections at our peril. To be thoughtful of our stewardship, our borrowing of the earth, enables us to realize that there is a complex whole that is beyond our left hemisphere acquisitiveness, our grasping of things. As stewards of the planet, not exploiters, we need, far too late in the day, to embrace the whole and allow it to encounter us. To know that we borrow the rich resources of the world, we don't own them. You could say we're living also on borrowed time, time stolen from the generations to come. So let's be inspired to make whatever changes we can, attitudinal changes, for they all add up. If we live aligned to the covenant of the deep order of the universe and the order of our lives, this can help us orientate ourselves to be better stewards, better borrowers of the resources of the earth. And so we turn to the last of our 4 aspects of a moral ecology that will prompt us to change. We need something blue. I was struck recently at the launch of Perseverance to discover life on Mars, the red planet. Despite the enormous skill and extraordinary testimony to human endeavour, why does my heart cry aloud in protest? Is this not escapism on an interstellar scale, seeking to escape the challenges of saving this beautiful Earth, captured in December 1972 by the crew of the Apollo 17 spacecraft on its way to the moon? From a distance of 18,000 miles, the Earth is a blue marble, a precious jewel, a thing of wonder and beauty to be treasured. Forget the red planet. Remember the blue and green of our fragile Earth. I am overwhelmed in lament for this beautiful world, which we are destroying faster than we know. Sometimes the grief is too much. It has me sobbing myself to sleep, waking with a churning, desperate anxiety. How can we, as we must, stop the burning of the rainforests? How can we, as we must, stop the destruction of countless species of plants and animals? How can we, as we must, love our forests and peat bogs which absorb millions of tons of carbon and not burn and splash, releasing carbon and carbon dioxide to compound global emissions already too high? How can we, as we must, hear the cries of the peoples who live in symbiosis with their environment and are forced to flee or face death? How can we, as we must, preserve and love this earth, its rainforests, for its sake, for its own sake, without that oh-so-human instrumental mindset? How can we fail to realize how the moisture and water that the trees absorb mean these enormous areas are like reservoirs, cooling the earth and keeping it fertile? The result of destruction, without the rainforests around, simply means desert, not fertile, arable land. I can't stay with the pain. I want to run away, unable to cope with the despair I feel. It burns within me, making my muscles tense with frustration and helplessness. I want to scream. I know why people self-harm. The pain is intense as I imagine the forest all flame, creatures destroyed by fume and fire. Indigenous peoples deciding not to run. Where would they go? I don't know how to contain this intensity within me. Perhaps perseverance is the rover, the runner in each of us. But life on Mars is not the answer. We must listen and hear the silent sobbing of this earth before it too turns into a red desert. I am the girl of the lyrics of the David Bowie song, for it is a god-awful small affair, our response, leaving us walking through our sunken dreams, too easily hooked by the silver screen. I want rid of the saddening bore of the film of deadened despair as yet another story of climate catastrophe is told, the stories that we live 10 times or more. Like the lyrics of the song, I am cut up and pasted together into a sense of unreality, with an emotion that cannot be contained by grief, wanting to spit in the eyes of fools. Only the power of deep lament can begin to express the pain, the frustration, the anger at this freakiest show. Is there life on Mars? I don't care. What about life on Earth? I understand escapism, but it won't do. The price is just too high. As we look towards COP26 in Glasgow this autumn, we need the nations of the world to pull together to save us all, to meet that 1.5 degrees target. That will take our entire carbon footprint, the 51 billion tonnes we currently add to the atmosphere every year, to net zero emissions by 2030. Is that too much to ask? Oh, that the power of the human intellect, the wealth of the world, is turned to this. Woods and forests are now valued, and the ability for trees to capture carbon is accepted widely. Cost? It's estimated that 1 trillion seedlings, which would remove 2/3 of all the carbon dioxide that human beings have ever released into the atmosphere, would cost a minimum of £240 billion. That's not nothing, but it's a drop in the ocean compared with what is spent on escapism, including trips to find life on Mars. This blue marble, this blue planet is worth saving. It won't be saved if we all sink into blue depression and anxiety. It is clear to me that we need to balance the urge to immediate activism with a contemplative spirit, one that takes our anger and denial and pain seriously, even as we order our lives with a different economy. What makes this planet blue? Laying aside complex theories of colour, it's the water of our oceans, of our rivers, our skies. What might it be to live in the element of water, treasuring it as springs of living water gushing up to eternal life? My contemplative thoughts go towards clouds, and the taste of an acrid cloud sour in the mouth and throat, which leaves us voiceless, gasping from the particulates, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, ground-level ozone, carbon dioxide, black carbon, lead, the methane of our roads and cities, but also unable to voice that profound sense of loss as we lament the future, when everything is prefaced with, like there's no tomorrow. Theologically, this is a kind of via negativa, a cloud of unknowing. You'll know perhaps the cloud of unknowing, a text of English mysticism from the 12th century. The cloud of unknowing tells us that we begin to know God when we enter into the darkness of the human condition, the dark night of the soul, when we reach the limits of human understanding and speech and know ourselves in a cloud of obscurity. The mystic teaches us that when that cloud or fog of unknowing surrounds us, as it surrounds our troubled world, we need to let it clothe us, to participate in it, to seek it as the mantle of God's grace, to learn dependence again, instead of running away in frenetic busyness, angry displacement, despair, and debilitating anxiety. The cloud offers the opportunity to know again our dependence on the God of grace. To enter that cloud of unknowing, to take on a mantle of God's grace, is to live paradoxically, simultaneously with fear and hope. It is to know that we are all entangled with the environment, with the world around, other peoples and nations, in a world that needs coordinated action, political entanglement one with another, sustained and energized by the spiritual sense of God's entanglement with creation, in which we participate. Whether we believe in God or not, we can continue with faith, hope, and love together in a covenant one with another and with planet Earth, inspiring ourselves with stories that renew our sense of commitment to the past, present, and future. We can change as we engage deeply with the natural world around, taking time to lament the passing of the normalities of the future that perhaps will never happen. Activism is crucially important, perhaps to march on the streets as Extinction Rebellion do, but certainly to change the consumerist habits of our generation, resisting the market forces that commodify our lives. Any activism, though, needs to be inspired and sustained by a process that takes us again and again from despair through lament to fierce hope that has eyes to see and ears to hear the deep order and song of the blue planet, and to trust the grace that we're given. And so, yes, a new moral ecology for a world where climate catastrophe is real. Something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. Thank you.